Good evening and good day. I have a huge pleasure to meet Dr. Roger Ray, Reverend Dr. Ray, as he names himself. Uh, I can hear you with echo. I don't know why. Doctor, may you mute when we...
I can use my earbuds if that'll take the echo away.
Or, no, maybe it's me. No, it's okay. I think it's my problem. So, okay. So don't use earbuds. It was my mistake. I heard echo from other device, I think. So first of all, hello everyone. It was my sound issue. So in general, first of all, I want to say it is a huge pleasure to have Dr. Ray, and I will want to start on my end how I met him, and he will start maybe how he met himself to be in this place to talk about us. A bit later, he will discuss a topic which is important to him, and I would be very curious what he has to say about it. And after that, and even in the meantime, you can ask questions if you have any question, and we'll put when the time arrives for everyone who is interested. Okay, so first of all, so for Dr. Ray, I was kind of a Baptist, kind of from age of 16, 15 to age of 30. I kind of never was a fully literal Baptist. And I remember that the first time when I read the Bible, I was finding rabbits chew cud. Rabbits chew cud. It's in Leviticus. It's one of unclean animals because they're chewing cud. And my family was with many researchers. They were believers, but they were very science oriented, to say so. But anyway, when I see rabbits chew cud, I said, that's definitely a mistake. I mean, Baptist, I believe in Jesus, died for my sin. Rabbits don't chew cud. So anyway, even from that age, I was conservative, I would say, but I was still with tendencies to live that path, to live a narrow path, which some people say. But later, kind of in few years from that, I was interested in the Bible study and so on. And the one part which kind of mostly shifted me initially, it was the books of John Dominic Crossan. He is a very known Jesus historian, New Testament scholar. And for example, I would strongly recommend this book, like Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. And in that book, when I was reading first time, I would say, oh, it's impossible that pastors or I don't know, academia would say something like that. How could Jesus die on a cross and not put in a grave? How a Christian would say it from all of them? How a priest, a Catholic priest, a respected Catholic priest would say this? You'll see him in the documentary. And so this was my biggest strong take outside. And later I was getting on his friend, meeting his friend who we have a shared connection with the MBT today or tonight, meaning John Shelby Spong. So John Shelby Spong was a friend of Crossan. They are friends in this very known Jesus seminar. And I would say it was a 1-2 punch. One was the Crossan, the other was Spong. So what Crossan killed in history, Spong killed in theology. You could not become a conservative Christian after that, at least in my honest view, especially like, but so this was kind of my journey. And I remember later I was reading, maybe you heard, it is one of the most atrocious books, apologetic book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It was saying, if you read it, you'll become, you can't doubt the power of the Bible and so on. So this was the competition, so I read it and I said, oh no, this is trash. Sorry for Lee Strobel's fan. So this was my journey, and later I lost my faith, but it was nothing related with Spong and Crossan. Anyway, if I will become tomorrow a Christian, I will never become a conservative given my background. And I lost my faith in a series of a lot of suffering of some close friends of mine, just to be clear for Dr. Ray. And I could not make sense of the suffering. But this has nothing to do with Spong or croissant. So I think it's enough. I bored people enough with my story. May you say yours?
Yes. I grew up in rural Kentucky, and I had the good fortune of growing up in a church with an educated pastor. So I was never inclined towards conservative Christianity and was always familiar, at least, with the names of primary scholars, biblical critical scholars. But when I earned a degree in philosophy and then went to Vanderbilt for my seminary work, and we read Rudolf Bultmann's Demythologizing Jesus and that material that told ministers that while you learn to be biblical critics and you learn not to be literalist in terms of your creedal belief background, you're also taught that you've got to use the language of the church. You've got to keep saying the words that the church is familiar with, and you sing the hymns that the church is familiar with. And John Shelby Spong, who you mentioned, is actually the late John Shelby Spong. He died a couple of years ago, but was a good friend of mine, and he's endorsed my books, and we've lectured together. We've done seminars and conferences together. But we disagreed on this point, that John continued to use the traditional language of the church, even though he did not mean by those words what people in the pews think that he means. Like, I don't believe there's a heaven or a hell. John would say that he believed that there was some kind of life that went on after your mortal life. But I discussed his manuscript with him before it was published, and I didn't see that he had any particular reason to support that view. But he would still participate in traditional Episcopal liturgy and baptisms and that sort of thing, which I quit years ago. Once you begin to pull the thread of supernatural theism, and even if you look at it in terms of the history of the German schools, of they began to be critical of Old Testament literature. That's fair. You're not messing with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right.
You could deal with that. But once you start to pull that thread, you don't ever find a very good stopping place. So eventually all of that stuff becomes suspect, at least, and harder to believe. Cyprian, where I find it odd, both for you guys in Europe, and I spend a lot of time in Central and South America, and it seems like the choice is you're either Catholic, Pentecostal, conservative, or you're an atheist. And for those of us in the field of academic theology, there are a whole lot of places in between conservative and atheist. That there are ways.
I agree. Sorry to just to remark one thing. I notice very often that if I meet an atheist who doesn't know any literature like Christian academia literature, I notice I'm closer to you, let's say you, Roger, than with them in everything. Like, do you believe, I don't know, that Jesus was going to Bethsaida, or Bethesda, sorry, Bethsaida is Romanian, Bethesda, and there was an angel making this? No one believes this. It's a story. Yeah. It's a, you understand? Yeah. And only atheists take it literally, and these conservatives. But I'm sure you don't. I'm sorry to.
Well, I don't know if you want me to launch into my talk or what I wanted to discuss with your audience today. But in terms of my own background, I grew up in at least a progressive Christian environment, which is virtually unheard of in Central and South America, and it's
And in Europe,
unfortunately
yes.
rare in Europe,
Yes.
particularly Eastern Europe. You're either Orthodox or Catholic or nothing at all, and so I was never in the conservative camp, but I was willing to participate in baptism and communion and all of the trappings of traditional Christianity until about 15 years ago. And as I became more interested in academics and more progressive in my theology, I realized that the denomination I'd grown up in was going the other way. So I am an unaffiliated Unitarian now. But I realize that's not very familiar to many people in Europe these days.
I think one part, can you describe what a Unitarian is? As far as I know, we have a small church in Romania, but Unitarians, no offense.
The Unitarian Universal.
At least some of your beliefs, yes. Yes, we don't have we have Unitarian, we don't have Universalist Unitarians.
Yeah.
As far as I know, there is not even one church in Romania. So
Really?
May you describe what you kind of stand for? You don't go to all 100 doctrines, if possible.
Yeah. It really is an association of people that have been disenfranchised from traditional religions. So in the local Unitarian congregation, there are people who are pagans, there are people who are pantheists, and people who are atheists. But the overall desire is to put up an umbrella and say we can all stand under the same umbrella. But most of us in the Unitarian movement are either atheist or pantheist or humanist, but the notion of a supernatural theistic God is foreign to almost all of us, even though most of us grew up that way. Most of us,
I can understand,
came out of that tradition. Yeah.
That's really great. One part which I would say, and for people who are not aware, on the description there is the direct link to the page of the church, CCC Springfield, on the YouTube and the site, sscf.org, if I remember. So please follow at least the YouTube. I think you had really amazing sermons. I say to you, maybe you can repeat one or two of them, but tonight we'll not talk this ones. So I think we may even start with what you had planned.
Well, what I would really like to talk about is the notion of having a spiritual life without having a supernatural theistic God. And I want to point out that among the world's religions, Buddhism is not just one way of being Buddhist. There's lots of different kinds of Buddhists. But by and large in the East, we are accustomed to thinking of Confucianism or of Buddhism as being just barely a religion. A lot of Christians would say it's not really a religion because they don't have a heaven and hell and they don't have a supernatural theistic God, but they have a spiritual worldview. They believe in a God that is beyond definition. And a lot of us out of the academic traditions in the West would agree with that perspective on God, that I don't describe myself as being an atheist, but trust me, Cyprian, everyone who reads my newspaper columns in this area that goes to a regular church, they call me an atheist because my faith doesn't click enough boxes for them for me to be considered a part of them. But we understand a religious life to be about moral teachings and not about doctrinal beliefs. There's orthodoxy and there's orthopraxy. Orthodoxy is having the right beliefs, and orthopraxy is having the right behaviors. If you actually go back and look at the roots of Western religion, there was a form of Semitic religion, it wouldn't have been called Judaism, but a form of Semitic religion that was an animal sacrifice cult. It was a polytheistic faith, but after the Babylonian exile, when the Hebrews were taken into slavery in Babylon, they were introduced to the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was basically a slave religion. And the slaves in Babylon had fabricated a belief in a life after death, that their actual life was so miserable that they believed that the scales of justice would be balanced after death, and that all of their slave owners and captors and persecutors would fall into a lake of fire, but they would walk into a paradise to exist. So the Jews
Sounds common.
Yeah, the Jews took that idea and added it to their religion. The Jewish religion became a monotheistic religion, and a religion that at least had a cursory belief in life after death after the Babylonian exile. So Zoroastrianism informed first Judaism, then Christianity, and then Islam. And even though Zoroastrianism still exists, it doesn't exist in the numbers where very many of us are very familiar with it. But if you've ever known anyone from Iran, a lot of the people you will meet that no longer live in Iran will tell you that they are Persians. And even though they may officially be Muslim, they might, if you get to know them well enough, tell you that their real religion is Zoroastrianism. But in Zoroastrianism, the belief was that after death, you walked out on the Shinvolt Bridge. And if you had lived your life with good thoughts, good deeds, and good words, those three things, if you said the right thing and did the right thing and thought the right thing, the bridge stayed flat and you walked across into paradise. But if you were found to have not lived by those three principles, the bridge turned on its side and it was as narrow as a knife blade, and you fall down into a lake of fire. So these slaves believed that as they walked across the Shinvolt Bridge, they could look over the side and see the slave masters burning alive in that lake of fire, which I suppose has a certain satisfaction to it, I guess, if you feel like you deserve that. As I often tell my friends here, I don't believe there is a hell, but there are certain people who make me believe that there ought to be one. You know, right now we're going through the January 6th hearings in a joint session of Congress and the Senate of the United States. And trust me, there's a whole lot of us that believe that Donald Trump should go to hell if there were one. But unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any good reason to believe that there is one. But Zoroastrianism began as a slave religion. I could say similarly that Buddhism began as a practice, a meditation practice among the poor. The Buddha himself, the historical Buddha, if we can confidently know much about the historical Buddha, there's nothing written down by him and nothing about him for 500 years after he was dead. But assuming that any of our information is accurate at all, he was born to wealth, rejected wealth, and lived among the poor. Moses, of course, was a part of a slave community. If you take that historical narrative at face value, and became a liberator of slaves. If you ask yourself, what is Moses' job description? It wasn't teaching people to believe in certain things, certainly not so that they would go to heaven. Moses would have never heard of heaven. But it was about social justice. It was advocacy for the poor against the oppression of the rich. Come to Jesus, and you see a very similar dynamic. Palestine was occupied by the Roman army. They were sorely persecuted. They were being impoverished as their agricultural produce and such was being taken by the Roman Empire. And so Jesus could be seen as a revolutionary against the empire, as an advocate for the poor and the oppressed. We like to credit him with being much more modern and advanced than he probably was. He may have at root been quite a racist himself and an advocate for his own people, but at least he was an advocate for the poor. Again, it's not part of the reputation, but if you look at the historical Muhammad, the religion of Islam begins as an advocacy for peace, to stop the warring conflicts of the tribes, and to advocate for the most vulnerable members of society. Now, in the case of every one of these religious founders, Zoroaster and Moses, as much as we can know about them historically, Jesus, whom we also have to be pretty suspicious about what we're certain of historically. And you mentioned John Dominic Crossan. I'm a member of the Jesus Seminar, and I've been in meetings with John, and I've said to him that sometimes he writes like he had a video camera there, that he's absolutely certain of how things happened. And you could argue with a lot of those things. As I like to say to him and other members of the seminar, a reasonable person might disagree, but at least what we can know of Jesus, and certainly what we know of Muhammad, because we know a great deal more about Muhammad. He was in the 5th century. He lived a lot longer, and there were literate people around him that were writing and documenting his life and teaching. So we know in each of these major world religions that the founders intended to be advocates for the poor, the oppressed, and those that were suffering from various kinds of violence, whether it was racism or occupation, military occupation, or even gender violence. But within 1 or 2 generations, those religions were codified into a set of beliefs and basically taken over by the government, so that the government uses the religion to help control the poor. Each of the founders was a liberator of the poor, but the religion itself becomes...
Given enough revisions, it would be...
Pardon me?
Given enough revisions, it became a useful tool.
Yes, yes. And if you've ever been to a Church of England service, for me as an American Protestant, it really, really jumped out at me that they're literally singing hymns to the Queen. And in another era, they would have been singing hymns to the King, that the state is really the religion, and you use the language of Christianity and Scripture, but there's an awful lot of monarchical worship.
I know 2 anecdotes. When you said about the Queen, I have King James when I was, but I know I forgot which was the Bible just before the King James, but basically what was painted, it was the Queen giving the word of God to humans, to people, to mortals. So it's the same vision of...
And even if you go back and look at ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or some of the material from Sumer, you oftentimes see a very large figure handing a scroll or a tablet to a king. And there is that sense of the connection between the deity of that particular region and the monarch, the pharaoh, the king, whatever, the ruler of that area. So the major world religions began as protest movements, but they didn't get to stay that way very long. Part of the problem with Western religion, which is really what I want to get at primarily today, if I can just plant one concept that sticks with you and your listeners, was the process of what we call, and forgive me if these English terms are not readily available to your vocabulary, but it's a process we call personification. That is, making something...
It's Latin.
Yes.
Romanian, it's a Latin language. We understand it.
Okay. But in the ancient world, if there was a volcano, you might personify it and say that the mountain is angry, or you personify the ocean, which is either calm and gives you lots to eat, or the fish die off and there's a tsunami or a flood or whatever. So the human beings experienced the world through their emotions, interpreted the world through their emotions. But then we also projected our emotions onto nature. so that the earth is a mother, the sky is a father, the sun is a person, it's a deity, the moon is a deity. And that language becomes so much a part of us that it ends up in our sacred scriptures, it ends up in ancient poetry, and it becomes the way that children are taught to understand their world. And even when you pray, you pray in a way as if you are talking to another person who is like you, that personification. And even angels and demons become named people. You look even at modern movies and television shows in which angels and demons and these spirits are personified. They are given a body, they're given a name and a character and a face, whether it's frightening or whether it's wonderful. Uh, you mentioned Lee Strobel, who was a great apologist back in the 70s and 80s, but a recent apologist was a neurosurgeon who wrote the book Proof of Heaven. And if you've ever read it, you realize there's no proof in it at all. But he describes a near-death experience in a medical setting where he was under anesthesia, and he had a vision of a beautiful, blue-eyed, blonde woman who loved him unconditionally. Well, we've all had that dream. That's not proof of anything. All that proves is that he's a dirty old man. You know, he's literally having a highly sexualized dream that is so profound to him that he is wanting to write about it and convince you and me and other people to take his near-death experience in the hospital as somehow being theological evidence. It is not.
I want to comment one thing. Sorry if.
Sure.
So one part which I noticed on people who have these experiences, some of them are just in extreme conditions, some of them just like a dream or vision. And I meet people saying, I met Mary or Jesus. And I said, which skin did it have? It was white.
Yeah.
Which language did it speak? Romanian. Come on, Jesus would not know Romanian. You made him speak, your brain, basically. But
of course,
yes.
Of course. And of course, if you grew up in Asia, Buddha appears to you. If you grew up in Eastern Europe, Mary appears to you. If you grew up in North America, Jesus appears to you. So,
right.
And again, we have a great historical example of this in the person of Muhammad. Muhammad had his first vision in the cave outside of Mecca and Medina. And he thought that he had been possessed by an evil genie, what they called a jinn. And so he was thinking that he needed to commit suicide because he had been possessed of a demon. And his wife convinced him to go visit a cousin of hers who was well read in Christian and Jewish scripture. And it was this cousin who convinced Muhammad that it was not an evil genie, but it was the Archangel Gabriel. Well, now, if you make a movie of that, which you're not allowed to do since you can't show images of Muhammad, but if you were to make a movie of that, how would you represent that first vision? Because he didn't recognize an angel, and the angel didn't reveal a name. He had a profound experience, possibly brought on by fasting and dehydration in the wilderness, but nonetheless, he had a vision that was meaningful to him, but he didn't even know how to interpret it until months later when his wife's cousin had educated him a bit in the narratives of Jewish and Christian scriptures. But then once he has that language, he keeps going back to the cave. He was illiterate. He didn't write anything down, but he would go back to the cave, have another experience, and go and dictate the surah of the Quran to his wife. So once it becomes concretized, you know, it's now the angel.
Yes, it loses the experience, first of all, philosophically. Yes.
Yeah, you take a mystical experience and you turn it into something else. we can see the same kind of thing in the Apostle Paul. If you're familiar with the New Testament letters,
The Damask, you mean conversion in general, or but I know all the letters. If you mean this,
yeah. Well, Paul wrote some of that, and some of that was written in his name by somebody
by
after
Luke.
Paul's dead.
Yes, let's say by Luke in quotes. Yes,
right. But if you look at 2 Corinthians, Paul describes his conversion experience, and he says,
like the vision, it's clearly a vision. Yes,
he says, I knew a man who in the spirit was taken up into third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. And he saw things and he heard things which cannot be described and cannot be repeated. So that's Paul's description of his conversion, right? It was a mystical experience. He doesn't quote anything. He didn't say that he saw Jesus or anything. He just said, I know a man who 7 years ago was taken up into third heaven and this. But after Paul is dead, the book of Acts is written, and the whole book of Acts is intended to sort of polish Paul's reputation and make him seem more important. So the author of the book of Acts, whether it's Luke or whatever, the name Luke's attached to it, he says he's on the road to Damascus. He is knocked to the ground by light. He hears and sees Jesus, and that when the experience is over, there's scales over his eyes. The people with him saw the light but didn't hear the voice. He's taken to a specific place in Damascus on Straight Street where a particular disciple prays over him and scales fall off and he regains his sight. None of that would have been familiar to Paul. If that had happened to Paul, he would have never stopped talking about it. But nothing in Paul's letters describes anything like that. But you see, Cyprian, this is how a profound experience becomes codified, and then it becomes a belief system, But you will have people in Pentecostal churches, especially, who want to describe their conversion experience as having been like Paul's, but like Paul's experience in Acts.
By Luke, yes.
Not Paul's experience as he described it in 2 Corinthians. And I remember I was a graduate fellow at Harvard, visiting fellow several years ago, and I was taking a course under one of their famous New Testament professors, and he talked about Paul being knocked off of his donkey on the road to Damascus. And after class, I just gently pointed out, there's no donkey in the book of Acts. He was walking. But people get, like, you go to an art museum and you see a painting of the Damascus Road experience, and you incorporate all of those particulars into your belief system. So a group of kids in Paris or in France, in rural France, have a religious experience, and they say it was the Virgin Mary that appeared to them and gave them the rosary or whatever. So you take your religious background, your set of beliefs, and you incorporate whatever experience you have into the language of your own beliefs.
I want to comment one thing about Luke. Maybe I think you would agree with most of it or all of it. But what I noticed, and just to say, I'm not at your level of scholarship in any means, so please correct me. One part which I noticed when I read about Luke, it was this idea of having this story that it goes from Nazareth, goes to Jerusalem, goes to the end of the world, and Luke says at the end of the gospel, I give you a commandment to go to your house, to go to, I forgot, to your house, to your city, till the end of the world. So he writes the story like this. So it's clear that all the events matched his story. And when you compare, for example, Galatians 1, when Paul says, I was to meet Peter and Jacob, and
James,
no one should, James, sorry. Jacob means in Romania. I don't know why we use Jacob for James. It's James. So, and you should be sure I didn't give up anything, basically. We agreed that only I should be, I think we should be, I forgot the word. Basically, you should be kind to your fellow. This is all we agreed. And in Luke, everyone agreed in the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
How so?
Yeah.
So Paul said, I didn't agree with anything, but
Now,
for Luke was
Paul actually did write Galatians, and
yes.
it's interesting from a psychological vantage point. Paul never met the historical Jesus. He never knew Jesus as a living person, but then he goes and he meets with the brother of Jesus, cousins, friends of Jesus, and he refuses to let them tell him anything about Jesus. Now that's really arrogant right there, isn't it? That he's right there where he could have actually recorded something about Jesus, and by his own admission, he says, I didn't receive anything from them. He was insistent that what he wanted from them was for them to validate him, but not to teach him. Now, what did Paul actually know about Jesus in terms of his message or his mission? We assume that the traditions of the church would have taught Paul a little bit. Like in 1 Corinthians, he recites the doctrinal method of having communion, the words of institution of
Also in
communion.
First Corinthians, he comments on the marriage, and he says even Jesus was not basically denying divorce. He said you can divorce because at the end times you shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
So Jesus, I mean, Paul gets Jesus says this, but you should interpret it, which is.
Now, I know you've read some of Spong and some of Crossan. I don't know if you've read any of Marcus Borg's work, who was
I heard is very influential. I never read it.
Yes. Marcus is also deceased, but of everyone that is a known scholar from the Jesus Seminar, I would say that Marcus Borg was the nicest person. If you were going to go out for a cup of coffee, you would want to go out with Marcus Borg. In fact, a few years ago, I was doing a series of lectures in Great Britain, and one of the host pastors said to me in the car on the way to her church, she said, Roger, would you mind trying to be a little bit more like Marcus Borg and a little less like John Spong? I just had to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to be all Roger Ray. That's all I know how to do. But Marcus Borg was a very nice man, and he would articulate the kinds of things we discussed in the Jesus Seminar in such a way that it was more palatable to traditional churchgoers. I feel like at this stage we need to be more confrontational, but Marcus Borg wrote, his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. I use that when I teach college classes on the historical Jesus. I use that because if everything you know about Jesus you learn from a Protestant Sunday school class, it's jarring to actually look at biblical criticism. I mean,
I know. I know. I came, as I said to you, Croissant. Initially, I wanted to kind of burn the book, but I noticed it's quite historically backed. So I know he's very confident. But
yeah, the first time I met John Spong, I told him, I said, when I bought your book, How Christianity Must Change or Die, I would read a couple of chapters and I would get angry and throw it across the room. And, it's like a cat in catnip. I would try to ignore it for a week or two, and then I would pick it up and read another chapter and get mad again. But it's hard when you have grown up in a mental prison to accept being set free. But biblical scholarship, if you stick with it, will set you free of those traditional beliefs. But I mentioned Marcus Borg because one of his books, and the name of it now escapes me, but he took the New Testament and he published it in the order in which it was written, so that you see the evolution of the Christian religion over the 40 or 50 years in which those documents were written. And like Galatians is probably the oldest.
The first or the second? The first or the second, depending on Thessalonian, I think.
Yeah. Maybe First Thessalonians, maybe Galatians, but that would be at the beginning, not at the back of the New Testament, the way it's printed now. So then when you get down to the Gospels, Mark was first. And when you read Mark, there's no birth narrative, there's no Christmas story, there's also no resurrection appearances. The women find the tomb empty and they go away amazed, but there's no vision of a resurrected Jesus. Now, again, as you know, Bishop Spong and I disagreed on this point. Spong thought Matthew came next, copied Mark, brought in other material.
That's my position too, but not because of Spong. But yes.
And
but I'm not
and then Luke. Yes. I argue that Luke was next, and I'll give you a good example. There's the Beatitudes.
I know the one you said it to me in private before, but I think.
Yeah, this is probably the same one because I use this with my students in college. In the Beatitudes in Matthew, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." In Luke, that same saying is rendered, "Blessed are those who are hungry, for they will be satisfied." Now, Luke is talking about food. Matthew is talking about...
It's very clear to me as a scholar. I'm not a scholar, but other scholars. This is the part which I grant you fully. I'm not that defending that this is definitely an older version. It's clear. And it was all the passages kind of. The poor versus the poor in spirit. It's also plain. So it's clear.
I always say, have you ever met anyone who hungered and thirst for righteousness? And if you met them, would you want to be around them anymore? I mean, that's
no.
It's really kind of a scary idea, if you met someone and say, I'm really jonesing for more righteousness in my life. I'm like, yeah, well, you're not going to find it here, buddy. Just keep going. But it's obvious that the earliest Jesus tradition has to do with morality and social justice issues. And then the later tradition becomes increasingly religious and otherworldly spiritualized. One of the other members of the seminar that you probably don't know, one of my friends, Dr. Charles Hedrick, he would just say regularly, I don't think Jesus was all that religious.
No,
which is upsetting.
I agree. So I would say, I fully agree with you. This is also the croissant's view, if I'm right.
Yes.
So let me say to you why I think Luke is after Matthew, and as a amateur, but whatever I read, what convinced me. Okay. So first of all, I disagree with Mark and Q, but I know why it's popular. It's a good standard starting point of discussion. I fully agree with you. When we talk Lord's Prayer, that's the Q. Whatever you want, it's a sayings. It's coming copied. Okay. What I noticed, excluding the Beatitudes,
yes.
Beatitudes, sorry, is that first of all, it's clear there is clear dependency. Like, for example, when we compare the birth narratives, I know every atheist says how different they are, but it's surprising how familiar they are. So, for example, when the angel comes to Mary in one gospel, also the angels comes to Joseph in the other one. All this, there are many similitudes. If Luke has a genealogy, Matthew has a genealogy. So there are many resemblances. When Jesus is arrested in Gethsemane, you can match that the story copies Mark all along, but just the ending of the phrase is changed by Luke or by Matthew. And to me, I kind of always seen a longer, cleaner form, at least in English. Maybe you say it's not true in Greek. In Luke, maybe he's a better writer. It looked like, for example, Lord's Prayer. It's a bit longer in Luke. So this is what convinced me more, like it's in Luke. So excluding the Beatitudes, We name it happiness in Romanian. Happiness rules, but I don't know. So excluding that, which I fully grant you, it's the older tradition, and I think would be justified. All the other parts, it looked to me, are more elaborate in look.
Yes.
Maybe it's not the right word. So that makes
There's
me.
a lot of material there to discuss. Like we talk about the great omission in Luke, that in Matthew and in Mark there are 2 feeding miracles. In Luke there's only 1, and we wonder if Luke's copy of Mark was missing 3 chapters, or if he just decided to eliminate it. But you realize the way ancient writing was done, you have a scroll, and you have to be aware that you have to finish your book before you run out of paper. And so
Right.
actually the length of the piece of paper had to do with how long your book could be. So we don't really know what all forces were at work in that editing process. What we do know is, in terms of the vocabulary and the writing styles, that the birth narratives in both Luke and Matthew do not match the rest of the books. So whoever wrote Luke didn't write the Christmas story in Luke. And
I didn't know that. Sorry.
Pardon me?
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But they have many similitudes, as I said to you, in details. As I said to you, they have genealogies. They have the same story with the angel coming to different people. Well, it felt to me.
Angels appear in Luke, but not in Matthew.
I think they do. One, I think it says to Joseph, and the other one says to Mary.
Joseph has a vision, but yes, in Luke, the angel speaking to Mary, but in Matthew, I think Joseph has a dream.
Yes.
But it's very male centered in Matthew, and it's very female inclusive in Luke. Yes. Even that the exchange between Mary and Elizabeth, all that is in Luke. The Magnificat, all that is in Luke. Mary gets speaking lines in Luke, but not in Matthew. But the whole business of the story. Well, of course, in Matthew, Jesus is born in a house. In Luke, Jesus is born in a stable. In Matthew, there's a star and magi. In Luke, there's shepherds and angels. But there's virtually no similarities. Even more importantly, I think, when you look at the resurrection appearances, the resurrection appearances in Luke and Matthew do not agree with each other.
I agree.
While we know, or we're relatively confident, that both Matthew and Luke had copies of Mark in front of them, we're also relatively confident that Matthew did not have a copy of Luke, and Luke did not have a copy of Matthew, or there would have been more similarity. That's why a lot of scholars still talk about what we call the Q document. Q is just the first letter in the German word Quell, which means source, that Matthew and Luke had access to a sayings source that they incorporated into their Gospels. I'm not 100% sure that Q exists, because you could say that Matthew copied a version of Luke, or as John Spong says, Luke copied a version of Matthew. I feel that you're taking Spong's side in the argument, and Spong has sold a lot more books than I have, so I don't blame you. Go ahead. But,
no, it's all fine.
But I think I'm coming from the assumption that Jesus was more concerned about everyday matters of life and death.
I agree. And I said to you, the Beatitudes looks to me definitely from Luke, it's closest historically. Okay. To me, it's just that it's more elaborate. The stories in Luke felt to me it's a later edition.
Yeah,
that's the only argument I'm having. Not.
And again, if you look at the Gospel of John, which comes fourth in order, but also fourth in history, Jesus in John doesn't tell any parables. It's a completely different style of writing. And most of us believe that the Gospel of John was written in Rome, and it was written against the Marcion heresies, what the church called a heresy. But again, my whole point in saying that Marcus Borg put a book together where you read the New Testament in the order in which it's written, it becomes evident that the Jesus narrative is from the beginning, whether it's Mark or Matthew or Luke, from the beginning, it's tipping its hat from the start to the theology of Paul. Paul possibly originated the notion that Jesus had died in a substitutionary way as a redeemer. But I don't think Jesus thought of his death as redemptive. I think Jesus probably died as a result of opposing the authority of the Empire of Rome. But I think I've used more than my 20 minutes you wanted me to allot. So let's take some questions. But I'm afraid, Cyprian, you're going to have to translate the questions for me.
Yes, I promise to. Yes. So I put as a logo for our clip the lion of Mark, if you don't know. Yeah. So what does it mean, this lion? And why do you have it? Is it the Lion of Judah? This is the question.
Oh, why do I have it as a symbol of our church?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in the city of Florence, the winged lion with his paw resting on the gospel was originally on the city wall of Florence. It's now in a museum, and so the symbol of the winged lion as representing, in Catholic tradition, the Gospel of Mark, but for me, it simply represented that mythic character of representing the truth. Now, the inscription that we have on our banner, that I designed that logo myself, the inscription on that winged lion is actually a quote from Elie Wiesel, a Jewish psychologist or psychiatrist, that thou shalt not stand idly by. Because for me, the message of a spiritual community in the 21st century, particularly in the United States, is to not simply acquiesce to the injustices that are going on all around us, which we started this church in 2008. That's when I designed that logo. And I have to say, Cyprian, things have only gotten worse since then. That the need for a prophetic voice to stand up to the injustices of the world is more. But I wasn't showing a deference to the Gospel of Mark in doing that. It was just the symbol of the lion itself.
It's the best gospel anyway. Because
yeah, I think so. The most reliable.
I personally think it's the most direct one. It feels to me. It's like he wants, definitely Mark as a fake name, no matter what. He tries directly, and you can see this is the verse, this is what it means. Here, what it means in Aramaic, in Jewish language, let's say so. This is Mark, and all the others, they put a lot of laugh and clowns. And
yes.
Now,
Cyprian, I see there's a question from George.
Yeah, so I just translated to you. Okay. So that is Lion of Judah at the end.
Oh, that's his question? Okay.
Yes. So.
Okay. I thought that was your personal question. All right. I didn't want to ignore you, George. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I can put your questions as I get you here, and the people are more shy. If you can. So one part which I noticed, and I really recommend anyone to see on the church program. You have a series of demythologizing,
yes.
Demythologizing, and you put Judaism, Islam, Christianity,
and Buddhism and Buddhism and paganism.
Yes. So one part which obviously for my audience it will be Christianity first, but it looks to some person will say, look, you are not anything, you are not a believer, you are not a whatever. Why would you have an authority to say anything about it? If I mean, for me, I know why, but how would you answer for a more I don't know, Bible? Because also in my view, I had one debate with an I would say a funny story in a way. So as I've been an ex-Christian, I said, look, I know the Bible, I can debate Bible, and I can say why the Bible is not from God. But when I will criticize it, I will talk, and I knew a patristic scholar, but in Orthodox Church. And I say, please make sure two things: that all the arguments are acceptable for a Christian scholar, so it's a Christian argument, and it's not wrong. So whatever I'm saying, it's at least in your best of abilities, you understand, historically correct. So I can see how you can make a Christian argument and some fully atheist, for example. What gives you authority in your view in what you're saying? Like,
Well, I mean, I turn and show you all of that,
please.
all those degrees in theology and biblical studies, I guess, hanging on the wall. In that sense, it's the environment that I grew up in. It was the arena of my academic studies. I recognize, though, that for people who are traditional believers, that it may be somewhat offensive to think that someone who doesn't believe in heaven and hell, doesn't believe in a supernatural theistic God, doesn't believe that Jesus was any more divine than you and I are, that maybe I shouldn't even use the language or talk about it, but it is the heritage that I come from. I teach world religions in universities, and I always tell my students, you have to stand, if you want to look at a mountain range, you have to stand on one of the mountains, and you can look around and describe other mountains, but you're always describing it from the perspective of the mountain that you're standing on. The Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said that if you want to sew, you have to tie a knot in your thread. So I come from Christian tradition. I grew up in Christian worship. I grew up reading the Bible every day with my family, and I went to college and to graduate school studying scripture and theology. So it's the language that I'm familiar with, but you don't have to take it as being divine or even true. I mean, I think you find truths in the Bible about forgiveness and love and generosity and caring for the sick and the imprisoned and the poor and whatever. But I don't believe that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights and that Noah saved all animal life on the planet by putting two of every kind in a boat. The stories themselves, even the miracle stories, are
funny.
Well, they're either propaganda or they're metaphor. You know, that Jesus feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread, that may be a metaphor for sharing, but it absolutely is not a historical description of praying over a few loaves of bread and feeding thousands of people with it.
I think it's clear to me, and I'm not a scholar, again, I'm saying this as a disclaimer, that it's clearly a Moses reference. It's as plain as you can't say it more than Moses was doing the same thing. Moses was splitting the water. We walk on water. Jesus walks on water. It's as plain as this to me. It's not, and again, it's plain.
Elijah said to have raised the dead. Jesus raised the dead. Yeah, those become popular images. Even if you read Josephus, the Jewish historian, later in the first century, there were other elements of a good story. It always involved a shipwreck and being bitten by a snake. So Paul is in a shipwreck, gets bitten by a snake in Acts. Josephus claims that he was in a shipwreck and got bitten by a snake. It's almost like the car chase in a detective movie, that it's an element that has to be there for a particular genre of literature.
I can ask you, because you just said about the story to me, but maybe you'll see for other reasons. When I look to the Gospels, I could not see, I would say it. I will start with Mark, but maybe you'll say it's a wrong view. So all the Gospel, they strictly say, I'm not a witness. And maybe you have other arguments. So the Mark, the way how he says, Mark, I'm not the witness. You know, the traditional view is that everyone is a witness. is that Mark says, look, the centurion was the witness. You can't believe it. He's the witness. When the first chapter starts, look, the prophecy in the John the Baptist is a witness. The women, which no one believes, are the witness. And obviously there are miracles when he's alone, like going with, let's say, Satan or the devil in the desert, when you are the only witness. So the part is that when you read, you are the witness. It couldn't be Mark. And when you read Matthew, the theme kind of changes. Do you want a witness? Every prophecy is a witness, but he can't be a witness. And some prophecies, I would say, they don't match my view. And Luke says, I'm not a witness, okay? And John is the beloved disciple, a witness, but it's not him. He doesn't say it's me. So it's always, every writer says, there is a witness, look for it, probably it's you. You are the beloved disciple which runs for Jesus. You are the one who looks into the prophecies to see Jesus. So do you think what convinces you that are not witnesses, the Gospels? These are my views, at least why, like the writers say, I'm not a witness.
Well, I think there is an existential dimension to the way that they tell the story. Like the Gospel of Mark ends with the messenger angel at the tomb saying, he has gone ahead of you into the Galilee. You will see him there. Well, the Galilee is where he healed the sick. It's where he preached to the poor. It's where he fed the hungry. And so it does seem that the way Mark is written is giving you an existential invitation to go out into the Galilee and do what Jesus did, and you will see him there. Even in the Emmaus Road resurrection appearance in Luke, Jesus is recognized only in the breaking of the bread in the sacrament. And it is an encouragement to the church that you will experience Jesus in community when you are in community celebrating the sacraments. Even in John, Thomas the doubter, Jesus only appears on Sundays, which I think for we preachers, that's very convenient. If you want to see Jesus, you've got to go to church on Sunday because that's the only place you ever run into Jesus. But Thomas literally misses church one Sunday when Jesus shows up and he didn't see him. And so Thomas is telling his friends, I'm not going to believe unless I see him. Well, it's the next Sunday when Jesus appears to Thomas in community. And so a lot of early Christians, would emphasize the fact that Jesus is real and felt and known as resurrected, but only in community, when you gather in community. It's a preaching technique. I don't know how fair it is theologically, but it is a preaching technique. And really, when you think about what's the difference between an atheist and a progressive, like I don't believe in supernatural theism or life after death or heaven or hell, but if I were to retire entirely, leave this city where I've lived for 32 years, move to an island in the Caribbean, I would probably still try to find a church to go to because I want to be in a community. Now, it's going to be hard to find a church that would match my beliefs or respect my lack of beliefs, but we are human beings and we need to be in community.
I personally agree, and I really love when you made last sermon about global warming, which will not talk about some items, but one part which you also said that a lot of many people, when they think about faith in general, and you said it also no, sorry, this was in demetallizing Christianity. Sorry, I will not. So there you were making that distinction about practice versus faith, and one part which surprises me a lot, and when we were talking about Galatians earlier, and the single kind of agreement, excluding Paul was not listening, arrogance or not, the single argument which kind of people would agree was about helping the community. So they had a very different theology. So I personally think when people describe themselves, what makes you a Christian? Some people will say, I the baptism, you have to take the Bible literally. You have to believe in the creation. You die for the sin. First of all, Jesus, I think, could not say this.
Yeah,
I
really.
mean,
You wouldn't
and
recognize any of that. Yeah.
and even when I'm using this as a teaser, mostly for evangelicals, when they say, "What is for salvation?" and they say, "Look, Paul said you should believe in Jesus, but what Jesus said, you understand?" And the Jesus, what it said, I will use this passage. I use always Matthew 25 when Jesus described the, let's say, the judgment, and he described the separation between goats and sheep.
Mhm.
And what is very cool, if you read all the passage, it says nothing about faith.
Right,
Really.
right.
In fact, it
All about
criticizes,
orthopraxy. Yes.
yes, it always criticizes, in fact. It says, weren't we healing in your name? And Jesus said, I never knew you. It was never about faith. But he said the people who gave food and hunger and visit me when I was alone in the jail.
Yeah.
So to me, also, it how it sounds, you are a better Christian than Christians.
Yeah.
That they say, yeah, we are following the Bible, but they don't follow the Bible. This is, I also find it very ironic. You criticizing Christianity for the religious figures for hypocrisy. This was what Jesus was doing, and I found that this is so ironic that at least many progressive Christians, you especially included, they are such of Jesus-like without even pretending to be Jesus-like. You
Yeah.
understand?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sorry if it sounds this kind of praising you or something. It's not to make you fall, I raise it to fall as in sin.
About 20 years ago, there was, or 25 years ago, it was very popular in the United States among evangelicals to wear a bracelet that had WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I noticed they were for sale on the counter of retail stores, and even gas stations were selling these bracelets. 9/11 hit one Tuesday in 2001, and all of those bracelets disappeared because we didn't want to ask the question, what would Jesus do after a terrorist attack? Because we knew what we were going to do was bomb the hell out of Afghanistan. And we know Jesus wouldn't be down with that. So we didn't even want to ask ourselves what Jesus would do under those circumstances. And I've never seen those bracelets reappear. Of course, we've never really ended our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan either.
Right. So this is also shameful, and I I know that you talk also about more social issues like gun violence, which is honestly not a problem in Europe,
I
as far
know.
as I know, sadly. And I'm really saddened about this. Also, I won't say Romania has issues with racism, but not at this level. We mostly Roma people, known as gypsies. In general, we have issues in Romania, which we marginalize, but not as much as having ghetto or things like that.
Right.
And I also really appreciate for your work on this. Do you think a minister could marry two gay people or two lesbians? Or I know the answer. Do you think a minister should or could, in good faith, obviously, marry LGBTQ in general people? I think you can,
Well,
but
that's how I got fired from a denominational church. I was the first minister in this region that started to do same sex weddings for gays and lesbians, and that was in 1991. But it's the primary reason that I was fired, and there were demonstrators marching up and down in front of the church on Sunday mornings. I got death threats. I got a cut up dead animal
from
in the
Christians,
mail.
hopefully, right?
Yeah, these
Not
Christians who
the
pretty
loving
much wanted
Christians.
to kill me. But yes,
I have,
yes, being homosexual is truly just a matter of birth. In some rare cases, it may be a matter of preference, but almost always it's a matter of birth, and there's just absolutely no reason for us to maintain a prejudice about it. Now, ancient Hebrews were prejudiced about it, but there was a good reason for it. That's the reason why one man could have many wives, but one wife couldn't have many husbands. The point was to have as many children as you could possibly have in order to strengthen your tribe. And so at a time when population growth was equated with survival, then gay relationships were ill-advised in a practical sense. But by the time of Jesus, when population control was more valuable, you don't find any of the gospel narratives even mentioning homosexuality.
You have one question from.
Yes.
Can you read it? Who is Jesus for you, basically?
I do not believe that Jesus was incarnate God in any way that would be different than the way any of the rest of us are. Or as Marcus Borg said, Jesus was divine, perhaps to a greater degree, but not of a different kind than the rest of us. But in my book, Progressive Faith and Practice, one of the chapters asks the question, which Jesus do we hold dear? Because I think if you look at the historical Jesus tradition, there's actually about 5 different layers of describing Jesus in different ways. I think the actual person, Yeshua bar Yosef, who grew up outside of a Roman university town, that person was probably a social reformer. And by the time he was dead, his immediate followers started to describe him as a critic of the empire. But then by the time the empire takes over the religion, he becomes what theologians call an eschatological agent, or the person that brings about the end of human history. And only later does he become the savior who makes it possible for you to go to heaven. For me personally, the Jesus tradition is a collection of ethical teachings. But the stuff about miracles or resurrection from the dead, I don't believe all of that. But
do you think that Jesus was said by the Bible that Jesus said he is God? I think only in John.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
not by
Jesus,
himself.
In Mark, he doesn't even want to be called good. But again, if you read Paul's own narrative in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that Jesus appeared first to Peter and James, then to the 12, then to 500 of the believers. Last of all, he appeared to me, speaking as Paul. So Paul is saying that the way that Peter and James saw the resurrected Jesus was exactly the same as the way that Paul had encountered Jesus. And we know how Paul encountered him in a mystical experience. So Paul never mentions an empty tomb. He never mentions bodily resurrection. And I think Paul would have found those concepts to be absurd. But that's part of the codification of a religious tradition, that what Paul describes as all these people had an experience of the presence of God somehow, that they described as having been Jesus after he was dead, but then it gets codified into an empty tomb, the resuscitation of a dead body, and then Luke even has him flying up through the clouds, by some kind of jet propulsion out of the universe.
I also, just to compensate, but I know I'm weaker than you into saying, to me, Jesus clearly doesn't say he was God. Other people said, excluding John. In John, he says he's God. But even at that time, it is a special view of Greek. I think it's named Platonism or Neoplatonism.
Yeah, so Mark introduces his gospel, calling him the Son of God, but
but not God, I'm saying. So yeah, maybe he was adopted as a God.
But all of the titles given to Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels are the adjectives that come off of Roman coins. The Caesar was called the Son of God. He was called Savior. He was called Lord. So we attribute to Jesus, and that's where I say the second layer of the Jesus tradition was an anti-empire tradition, because Jesus then becomes Caesar. That Jesus is the authority for the church, which is to say that Caesar is not. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Savior. Jesus is born of a virgin, but not Caesar.
That's awesome, and it's a great reference. In fact, I didn't get to this one. I didn't know it till.
It took me an hour and 10 minutes to get to something you didn't already know.
No, don't get it like this. So, also I'm following you for many years, so I knew many things which people may not know it. So this is also an excuse. You say many things, and I take notes. One part which I was also surprised in a very good way is that when you present things, you present it in a positive way. And one part which, again, I didn't learn till you was, for example, how well you describe the women's rights given by Islam. So, in fact, sometimes you notice this, you heard it, but you didn't.
Yeah.
Till a person says it to you, didn't notice it. Like, like the Gospels are synoptic. They are relative.
Yeah.
Maybe when you read it in church, you don't know it. But when a person says, look, okay. And the part which I was surprised is, like, for example, you said that till Muhammad was no one giving so many rights to women. And I remember other reference that Lucifer was basically the Muslim tradition was put back into Christianity. You said it kind of 3 years ago or 4. Sorry if I misremember the years.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Your accent is thick enough that I didn't follow everything.
Okay, so the Lucifer or the angel falling, this is not in the Bible. No. It's a Muslim view which Christians adopted back. I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's okay. You have to wonder sometimes whether you're thinking about Milton's Paradise Lost or Dante's Layers of Hell, because a lot of what both of them expressed came out of sermons they heard in Catholic churches. So you get Catholic tradition that gets published in classical literature, and then it gets assumed to be a part of Christian tradition, and it's not necessarily. But what is Christian tradition? Are you talking about early 1st century, late 1st century, early 2nd century, early 4th century? If you're talking about the Christianity of the Roman Catholic Church, then you're talking about 4th century doctrinal stuff, but that wouldn't be something that even Jesus of Nazareth would recognize.
I will ask as a wrapping question, but if you want yourself, how much do you believe of the creed of Nicene or something like that? I know, as you said, Spong started like this, the book. Like, I'm not sure if you remember the creed. It's like, I believe in one God, the creator. I don't know it myself. But how?
Yeah, obviously.
I think in large, I don't want to look for all the details if you don't remember.
I don't believe that you can take the creed as a literal statement of either history or theological fact. That I don't believe in a supernatural theistic God. I don't believe God has kids. All of that. However, and again, I'll credit Marcus Borg with this. We have the word creed from the Latin credo, because it begins with credo. We translate that as I believe. And Marcus Borg said, in the 21st century, we should hear that as I beloved. I love this tradition. And John Spong really gets excited about, or prior to his death, obviously, got very excited about the notion that you can love the Christian tradition through which you and your family were united and learned about ethics and loving your neighbors and forgiving your enemies and all that. I love that tradition, but it doesn't mean that any one line of it, that he was dead and buried and raised on the 3rd day and descended unto the dead. You don't have to believe as a literal fact any one of those lines, but you can say, I love that tradition. Now, again, personally, I don't love the tradition because I think we've taught one generation after another bad critical thinking skills that as Voltaire said, if you can get a person to believe in the absurd, you can get them to commit atrocities. So, it's just like propaganda in Russia. If we can believe polls out of Russia, which I don't know you can, but the polls out of Russia would indicate that nearly 90% of Russians are in favor of the invasion of Ukraine. Well, why? Why would they be in favor of that? But if you believe the propaganda off of state television, then you can say, yeah, I love Russia and therefore I'm patriotic and I support this invasion of Afghanistan. But if you look at the particulars of the invasion of Afghanistan, you have good Russian people, young soldiers,
Ukraine,
who have been taught that Ukrainians are beneath them, that they're subhuman, and that they can go and rape and murder and steal, and that is somehow what it means to be a patriotic Russian. So if you can convince people to believe in absurdities, then you can certainly get them to commit atrocities. And this has happened in every country and every generation. My father fought in World War II and in the Pacific, and he had been absolutely convinced that Asians were subhuman and that anything they did to them was okay, And then I adopted a Korean as my daughter. So you could see his head spinning in 1989 when he first realized that his grandchild was an Asian.
I personally, I heard the story because you said in the sermons, and I honestly think that, and I want for the public to follow your page, because I honestly think, regardless whatever, if you agree or disagree with Ray, Dr. Ray, that you did a lot of good for humanity, and you show how you can live and reflect on theology and spirituality in general, and to be a better force for good,
Yes,
for the world which we have
person.
to.
Yes.
And I personally think also that you didn't say, and excluding the LGBT rights and things like that, I know you fought for many injustices, and including, I think, sheltering, food, and all these things makes you more Christian than Christians again. Sorry for people offending who are listening and feel like that. And I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you.
And if
Thank you very much.
If you want, I'm honestly humbled, and I would want you to come in a future time when you feel like.
All right. I appreciate the invitation, and very nice to get to speak to your audience in Romania. And please forgive my Midwestern accent. I probably don't sound like the English speakers on American television and the movies, but I am from Kentucky, next to where Colonel Sanders' fried chicken comes from, Kentucky Fried Chicken. So
that's really awesome. I really love, and I hope people liked it too.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Have a good day and good evening.
Thank you very much.